Hey guys, my name is Rob, and today I wanted to talk about loudness in music production. Now, what spurred me to wanting to do this was I saw some other videos lately from some pretty prominent different YouTube music production personalities. They didn't all come out recently, but I just happened to kind of stumble upon a lot of them at once. And while they gave pretty well-meaning advice, and I'm sure the advice they gave was kind of to the best of their knowledge, I didn't think it offered very useful advice, and in some cases information that I thought was straight up wrong or really misleading. So my aim with this video is to both dispel some myths about loudness in music production and also to highlight the multitude of factors that go into making a song loud, quote unquote, and also emphasize how loudness isn't everything, but it's also not like the bane of the recording industry, like people have been talking about for the last decade or whatever. So this video is mostly aimed at people who have at least some familiarity with audio engineering and music production. I'll try to define technical terms when it makes sense to, but we'll see how it goes. So first, I just wanted to make the distinction at the top between volume and perceived loudness. Volume is like the volume on your car stereo or the volume on your TV remote. It's the user adjustment you make for loudness. So what really we're talking about is perceived loudness. And one thing that always seems to come up in any internet discussion about loudness is LUFS, or LUFS, or LUFS, or however you pronounce it. So LUFS are a measurement for digital audio for perceived loudness, and it's a standard that was adopted by the broadcast industry first. You know, everybody remembers and everybody hates, you know, how commercials are on the TV and then there's just that one fucking commercial that's super fucking loud. Nobody likes that. So broadcast industry adopted this standard. It just basically automates the process of keeping the loudness of commercials and TV programs to a standard so that that doesn't happen because nobody likes that. And at some point the music industry, especially with the advent of streaming, also adopted the LUFS standard. There's a lot of opinions out there about this. I see videos talking about how you should be very, very concerned about the standard LUFS measurement that services like Spotify and Apple Music and everything like that give you when you upload your masters to those services. And of course it makes sense, because of course you would want to adhere to the standards that the service is telling you they want, because you don't want there to be any problems. You don't want your song to sound weird or too quiet against the other tracks on the service. And this is kind of the threat that services like Spotify make about adhering to the standard. The standard they give, I think, is -14 LUFS and -1 dB true peak. The threat they make is that everybody knows since the advent of the loudness wars that even armchair audiophiles on the internet know that the crux of the loudness wars was the use of the limiter in mastering. Evil mastering engineers are sucking the life out of music. Some people say if you actually volume match them properly, they would sound quieter because they don't have as much dynamic range. Whatever. I lost my train of thought because I get so fired up about this. The threat that Spotify and similar services implicitly make is that if you squash your song's dynamic range too much, they will have to turn it down themselves using an algorithm, and ultimately your song will sound quieter than other songs on the service because people think that songs with more dynamic range will just inherently sound better and actually louder. And I guess what I'm here to say is that adhering to these particular standards, it's basically for suckers. And if you think about it, you'll realize I'm right. Obviously, your Kendrick Lamar record is going to sound hella louder on Spotify than, I don't know, whatever amateur recordist who uploads their master to Spotify. Like, it just is. And do you think Kendrick Lamar's mastering engineer is adhering to a -14 standard. You can disprove this yourself. You don't have to take my word for it. You can throw a Kendrick Lamar track in your DAW and just measure it with your LUFS meter and show that, oh no, not at all. It's like -8 or something. It's much louder. It's much, much louder. And so the question is, well, that's not getting turned down. Like, it sounds fine. It sounds great, obviously. It sounds great on Spotify. So why does the standard exist? And I don't really know. There is a great thread on Gearsluts. There's a great post. It's been sticky to the top of the mastering forum. Just a good list of reasons why not to bother thinking about these standards, which I'll link to in the description. But the long and the short of it is that there's no objective rules, and if a song sounds good loud, just make it loud. If a song should be loud, if it has impact when it's loud, just make it loud. I've gone on too long about this. This isn't how much of the video I wanted this to take up. But I want to offer an alternative way of thinking about metering loudness when you're mastering, when you're mixing, whatever. I just want to offer an alternative way of thinking about it that I think is much more relevant, much more helpful than simply saying, oh, well, it's -14 LUFS. It must be good, like, oh, it's the right volume. So personally for this, I use a VU meter, which is kind of similar. VU meters tend to be a good reference for perceived loudness. And that's how I want you to think about LUFS, is just as a reference. You don't throw out the whole thing. If you've learned how to use the LUFS standard, I learned how to use a VU standard from Professor many years ago. If you've learned to use LUFS and you understand it, just use it, but use it as a reference. Don't use it as a target. So for example, with the example of the Kendrick Lamar record, let's say that's a reference for whatever you're working on. Kendrick Lamar, great reference for modern hip hop. You can throw that into your DAW and you can check out the waveform, you can measure it with your LUFS meter, and then, only then, that you have compared your track to the Kendrick Lamar track, should you use that measurement as a target. So if I throw the Kendrick Lamar song into my DAW and it's -8, then I'm like, okay, great. I should aim for -8 on my LUFS meter. But that is only a tiny, 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 tiny piece of the puzzle when it comes to perceived loudness. As you will find out if you then proceed to stick a limiter on your track and bring it up to -8, because it will not sound as good. There are many, many factors that go into perceived loudness besides squashing dynamics. And I think this is the thing that people don't understand about the loudness wars, is that it's not just about squashing the dynamics in your songs. There's a lot of factors that don't have anything to do with that will make or break a song in terms of its perceived loudness and impact. And conveniently, I'm about to go through about every factor that I can think of for what makes a loud song. Okay, so the first one, it doesn't have to do a lot with audio engineering. It's arrangement. Arrangement matters a heck of a lot, a hell of a lot. If you've ever experimented with this in your own writing or music production, you'll find that arrangements of songs with fewer instruments are easier to mix, and they're much easier to make sound loud and have a higher impact. Hip hop is a great example. You think, oh, there's just a drum break and a sample and a vocal. You can make that shit super loud. You can make it so loud. Think of a classic example. Why do they call it the power trio, right? A rock band that's a power trio. Drums, bass, guitar, vocals, one of each. You can make that shit really fucking loud. Every instrument can be loud because there's a lot less competing in the space. When individual instruments can sound bigger, it increases perceived loudness. There's a lot of songs I hear where the vocal is just very loud and very present, and it really just makes the whole song seem loud. Even though if you compared it to another mix, you might find that, oh, the guitars in this song are actually pretty quiet. Or maybe it's the drums. Like I hear a lot, there is a trend a few years ago about, I just heard a lot of rock songs that were like drums and vocal, and the bass and guitar were just super quiet, and I hated it, but it made the song sound really loud because those things sounded massive, because they could be, because the space was left there. So this isn't to say that arrangements with a lot of instruments can't be loud. But the key to that is that the arrangement should be good. If the arrangement is good, you won't have a lot of instruments. You know, instruments exist where there needs to be space to fill out. And this always depends heavily on genre, but just in a very general sense, instruments should not compete with each other in a natural way. Everything will compete with everything in a mix, but usually if an arrangement is really, really good, it should be not that hard to manage if the arrangement is good. So well-chosen instruments that fill up different ranges will help the song sound full and balanced, which is a big part of loudness. Okay, the next one is something that I call macrodynamics. I have heard other people refer to this as macrodynamics. I think it's a good phrase for it. We talk very nebulously about dynamics in the song, specifically dynamic range, which is, you know, individual peaks on a waveform. How much range is there in terms of peaks and valleys of a waveform? But when we talk about macrodynamics, we're talking about also something that kind of relates to the arrangement of the song. Songs, by their nature, effective songs, have different impacts section by section. So the classic example would be, you know, the verse chorus pop song, right? In the verses, traditionally, tend to be lower energy. They tend to build tension to a chorus. And then once the chorus hits, that is the release of tension, the big impact moment is usually the chorus. So these are things that we should consider when mixing our song, because we know that these sections are supposed to be this way. So we need to do things that reinforce these section by section tonal shifts, mood shifts. Maybe the verse is very sparse instrumentation and then the chorus has a lot of instrumentation, or maybe some big grand new element comes in the chorus that gives it that impact. These are the things we have to think about, because preserving those macrodynamics within a song will give your track much more impact. The classic phrase is there can be no loud without quiet, right? You have to have some contrast in order. If a song is just one volume all the way throughout, or one mode all the way throughout, if it's just like going a hard 100%, it doesn't have impact, right? You need the quieter moments to have the impact of the louder moments. Okay, next I'm going to talk about compression, and I'm just going to get it out of the way because it's been over-talked, really, when it comes to this subject. The most important thing with compression to create the most impact with the sounds you're using is to do it in stages as much as you can. So a little compression applied at all stages is better than trying to apply it all at once. For example, if you were going to track a vocal, you would want to run it through, I mean, a lot of people will run it through a hardware compressor. You don't have to. You don't have to have a hardware compressor. If you have, you know, so many people have UA Apollos, you know, you have 1176 emulation, you can print with that plugin going in, which is actually really sick. So if you apply a little compression going in and then apply a little bit in the mix phase, that just means you can apply more as you go on, because you're taming these peaks at different stages, and that just tends to sound better than doing it all at once, because too much compression at once is more difficult to get right. Saturation is the other part of this. So there's a lot of videos on saturation. When we say saturation, we usually mean distortion, but more specifically, we usually talk about it's usually a gentle distortion, because if you say distortion, that's implied it's more harsh, and saturation is a more subtle form of distortion. What all these videos on saturation will tell you is that they shave off the transients in kind of a similar way to compression, but personally in a way that I find more useful. I tend to use more saturation as my first go-to than compression. It tends to preserve the punch of a source more than compression for me. Of course I use both, but it is not my go-to. If something needs work in the dynamics, generally I'll reach for saturation first and compression second. Not always, generally. And going along with that, applying saturation and compression in stages, and in that sense, basically peak reduction, rounding out of the sounds, which also tends to make them fuller. I tend to mix using buses. And I think I'm going to make a video on this at some point, but bus mixing is really useful, not just for kind of preserving CPU and the amount of plugins you have, but it also helps to glue groups of tracks together. So I might have a drum bus, I might have a vocal bus, and I might apply the same saturation and compression as a group. Or I might also apply individual saturation compression to the kick or the snare and then still send it to my drum bus and have whatever saturation and compression I apply there also apply to the one I already did stuff to. Just the idea with this, the very general idea, it's a humongous topic. The very general idea is to do it in stages, because doing too much at one time or deferring it to a later stage doesn't generally yield the best results. Okay, so my next one on my list is EQ, which I wrote most important and most ignored aspect, because that's how I feel. I think EQ, people talk so much about compression when it comes to loudness. I think EQ is the most important and the most ignored. Songs that have impact and a lot of perceived loudness tend to be very well balanced. And this goes back to what we were talking about with arrangement. If a bunch of instruments are perfectly filling up the different frequencies of a mix, that song tends to sound louder because all the instruments are able to be loud because they're not competing as much. This is similar here. An overall mix that has the proper EQ, that is kind of covering the whole spectrum of audible frequencies, basically, or at least a lot of it, we tend to perceive as louder. That's factor one. That's factor one. Balance with EQ is better. Factor two, there's certain frequencies that our ears hear more prominently or perceive as louder than others. This is just biological. Our hearing curve is not flat as much as you probably like to think it is. And there's just some frequencies that naturally, when we hear that, it's more cutting than others. I'll just give one example of this. It's the most important one. It's sometimes called the presence frequencies, or sometimes even the pain frequencies. I've heard, who knows how scientific this is, but I believe it and I remember it as the frequency that babies cry at. Because you know, when there's a baby crying somewhere, you can't ignore it because it just seems to like cut through whatever sound floor there is wherever you are. It just seems to cut through. Because biologically, supposedly, I don't know, I'm not a scientist, biologically, supposedly, and it makes sense that we would be attuned naturally to a baby screaming or crying, because biologically it's important that the baby get attention, right? If you boost frequencies in these presence, pain, whatever you want to call it, register, it's usually between I think of 1.5K to 5K, anywhere in there. Those frequencies tend to increase the perceived loudness of a track. There's a very common technique called a smile curve when it comes to EQ, and this is usually applied to a mix bus or a master bus. And all it is just to shelf the low frequencies a bit and shelf the high frequencies a bit, and you create like a little smile where the highs and lows are a bit hyped and the mids are a bit scooped, and that is something that our ears find really pleasing and has a lot of impact and can really increase the loudness of your song. So it kind of goes hand in hand with arrangement, like I was talking about before. having a good balanced mix, using the power of different frequencies to your advantage is more important than how compressed your song is in terms of loudness to me. Okay, here's another one. Limiters. It's kind of like compression, but this is what all the fuss is about, right? People using too many limiters, right? I wrote down some specific advice about how I use limiters. I don't know if I want to give that necessarily, not because I'm like protecting secrets or anything, but I think it's more important just to know how to think about these things and find your own approaches than for me to just tell you. So one trick that I picked up is that faster release times on a limiter tend to give you more perceived loudness, but the trade-off you get is more distorted bass. I don't have any scientific backing for this. This is advice that I got from someone at some point, I don't even remember, but I've used it and I've found it to be true. And it's one thing that I think about in terms of release times for limiter. Slower release times, I tend to think of as being maybe more natural, but possibly more pumpy and less loud. So that's how I tend to think about release times when setting my limiter. And both are valid, honestly. You have to serve the song. And this is what I haven't said, but I should have said through all of these, that all of this advice is just about serving the song. Hey, it's a bit later in the day and I'm editing the video and I realized that I totally skipped over something that I think is pretty important here. I had it in my notes, but I totally missed it. The reason I mentioned that when you have fast release times on a limiter, it can distort the bass. So when we're talking about loudness, bass is an important factor because in a lot of instances, bass can actually prevent a track from being as loud as it could be. And that's kind of a trade-off you have to think about. In some songs, like EDM songs, if you pay a lot of attention to the bass, and the track seems very, very loud, and I'm talking about like really, big room house type EDM songs, a lot of the times, the actual low end of the bass won't be that powerful because it's actually a lot easier to limit a track that doesn't have that much bass. If you ever listen to the band like Theoses or like, the 2010s buzzword like shitgaze style bands, lo-fi tracks that basically don't have any low end on them, they're very easy to make loud. You can slam them. I mean, obviously they're super distorted too, but you can slam them without much problems, in part because of the bass. So like I said, it's kind of a trade-off in terms of the bass. Oftentimes, it's usually worth sacrificing a little bit of loudness for a fuller bass. But again, it completely depends on the material, as always. But that's always a consideration. If you're having trouble using a limiter on a track, it's too pumpy, sometimes what can solve that is to just shelf off a little bit of bass. And that's just a matter of taste and a matter of judgment for what's going to serve the song the best. Yeah, so that's just what I wanted to insert into here. I'll just talk about two more quick things. I wrote down automation tricks. There's a lot of little tricks you can do with automation to increase the impact of different sections. The thing that I keep seeing in like EDM producer videos or whatever is automating your master volume. So at the chorus, maybe you jump it up a dB and it just gives more impact. These things are fine. Like I use that. I'll use that. But generally, those types of volume shifts are better done within the mix rather than right on the master. But sometimes you just got to do it on the master. Sometimes it's just way, way easier and it's a good little shortcut. Sometimes another thing I'll do is sometimes on a master. And when I talk about master, I don't just mean like in mastering, I mean the mastering bus in my mix or whatever. Sometimes if I want something to really, really hit hard, I'll just automate up the volume, not for even for the whole section, just like a really quick like bump right at the top of the transient and then have it drop off immediately. Because again, we were talking about like perceived loudness. It turns out if you do that and then take it away, the ear and the brain still kind of cling to it and they still perceive the whole thing as being that loud. So There's little tricks you can do like that. And then I also wrote down multiband. Multiband is not something I use very often, especially on like a full mix or a full master. Multiband is great on stuff like vocals or very tricky instruments, but I think the thing with multiband is that it's a surgical tool. If you're mastering your own production or mixing your own production, it's kind of like using a sledgehammer when you could use, I don't know, what do you use a sledgehammer for that you could use something more gentle? I don't have an analogy, okay. You're like smashing a window if you use multiband, which sometimes you have to do because maybe you don't have control over a mix or you're just sick of it and you don't want to do it anymore and it's just easier to fix it with multiband. But generally issues that you're fixing with multiband are things that would be, again, better fixed at the mix level, at a different level besides the master bus. It can help. It can definitely help. But when you're using multiband, you're rebalancing your whole mix, and ideally you would just do that in the mix. That's all I'm gonna say. Okay, and so that kind of runs down all of the factors that I believe contribute to the loudness of the song, and I think there are ones that I pointed out that I think are a lot more important than simply compressing a song too much, right? Over compressing has been seen on the internet among audio engineers, among audiophile idiots, frankly. Sorry, I just, I don't like audiophiles. As really degrading the inherent quality of a recording. And it's just not true. There's plenty of recordings that are very dynamic that also sound very loud. And there's no reason you can't use a combination of every technique to serve the song. Yeah, that's basically what it comes down to, just serving the song. Like, should the song be loud? Should this have a lot of impact? Do I want it to have more dynamic range? You know, do I want it to just be a distorted mess because that's what the song calls for? All those things matter way, way, way more than LUFS or, I don't know, whatever like dumb internet engineer flavor of the week thing that's like the new technical hotness that's going to just make your recordings so much better or whatever. It's all about serving the song. And I talked a lot about how you can make your song loud, but a lot of these things can still be employed even if you're not trying to compete with the Kendrick Lamar record. It's mostly about giving your songs impact. Yeah, and basically making the listener feel what you intend them to feel. You know, all of this is in service of the song. It's in service of the emotion that an artist is supposed to be trying to convey with the song, or the feeling, or the excitement, or the sadness, or whatever. These are just tools to help achieve those visions. And that's about all I really need to say. Thanks for watching. I don't know how long this is going to be. I talked for a long time. I think I'm going to make more videos like this. I have some other ideas for topics. I don't know if I ever said I live in Los Angeles. I've been an audio engineer in the music industry full-time for about 6 years. But obviously things are a little slow right now because if you're watching this future, there is a pandemic and also some very important conversations about police happening right now. So I've got a little extra time than usual. I'd like to keep continuing to do this even after things go back to normal, but you know, we'll see what happens. All right, great. Thanks for watching. I won't waste any more of your time for now. So yeah, maybe I'll waste more of your time later. Bye.